Hey guys, all right, this is aerobic development part two. It's going to be talking about a lot of things and illuminating a little bit more detail on the subject that we started the first one, which is the math test. That's just because there's loads of questions surrounding it. So I will try my best to kind of like make this very simple, but a lot of these questions get into the weeds. The first one is addressing problems with math. The next part I want to get into is some of the behavioral stuff. And then part three, I will save for self-care, which is the most important part about endurance. And that it's funny that I keep kind of like putting it off, but in order to get to the importance of self-care, how to do it, why to do it, and what the bigger implications are behind it, we really have to solidify first how to develop the aerobic system. Now, we introduced math testing into the first one. It was shocking to me to see how many people either haven't heard of it or have not ever considered developing their aerobic system in an actual, like, conscious manner. That's nothing against them. I think that is a subset and kind of a side effect of our society that has really not focused on anything other than talking about cardiovascular cardio, other than like the fat burning zone. And so we're really a society of people that don't understand how to develop ourselves because there's no real survival need to it. We don't need to develop a cardiovascular system for acute survival. But what we are seeing is because we don't develop an aerobic system, our longevity is going down because of that. That I think is kind of fascinating, that aerobic development plays this huge role in human life. It's responsible for so many things, and I don't want to I don't want to stay too long on this subject, but I think we need to introduce it correctly, because a lot of people in the fitness space for years have been talking about, oh, strength is the foundation for fitness, and we are aerobic by nature. And there is not a contraction in your body that can happen either submaximal or maximally without the use of oxygen. If you can't process oxygen effectively and efficiently, everything else is downstream from that. My favorite analogy for this is trying to think about this, foundationally. Let's just use a foundation. Yes, strength is the foundation for, let's say, a structure that we're building. And you have to be very cognizant about how you build it. We will get into strength training and why doing random acts of fitness do not develop a proper foundation. But when we are using this analogy, just think about like building a house on a property. We take for granted that we can just like bring the lumber in or the cement and the rebar and just start erecting some kind of structure, and we think that that is the foundation for everything. But I want to remind you, like, think of nature as bare land. We need a way to get those resources to the structure that we're going to build, and that is where most people really misunderstand how important the aerobic system is. The reason why we are building an aerobic system isn't so we can like participate in a 5K turkey trot or to like impress our friends with how many toenails we can fucking shred at a 24-hour race or some ultra bullshit. And that is really how most people view endurance today. It's either for sport or it's for like this, like, I don't know, ephemeral idea or concept of endurance where I just need to like punish myself for a long time and I will get a benefit from that. And both those concepts are wildly misdirected, but I find that is the most common way that people view endurance, and because of that, they're unable to develop it properly. Aerobic development is the resources to structure. So back to our analogy, if we were to build something that was to stand for a very long time, we need roads, we need water, we need to get our supplies to the structure. And that is really how I view cardiovascular training, as a way to develop all of the resources that need to be delivered to the processes that are happening. And so if you are more oxygen efficient, you can deliver more oxygen more frequently and better, all all of the other things go up. This is why it's foundational actually to strength sports. This is why you see kind of a conversion where instead of cardio kills your gains, it's become foundational to most recovery processes for strength sports. So thinking about it as this supply chain to other efforts or other physiology, I think that's the base that we should start from. Onto the MAF test. The MAF test describes exactly where, not exactly, but it describes where we become inefficient. And that inefficiency is where we turn over, and it requires kind of different pathways to fuel effort. And that's the really signpost that we've adapted, or we've got the most that we can out of that session, is by finding that point where efficiency falls off. So most people are like, how much of this do I have to do? The MAF pace kind of describes that actually. So what I described in the first video is like, we'll always use running just as the example because it's the easiest. But for instance, if I'm running at a certain pace and I know that that is my MAF pace, that's my efficiency score. It's telling me at what point I'm being inefficient once that breaks down. I think that's a really important thing to know because you've gotten all you kind of can out of that one session, and you have to go and repair and rehydrate and rest and come back, and all of the adaptations that came from that session will start to take hold, and the next time you should be able to push a little bit longer. Now there's lots of questions here having to do with how often do I do this, or when does MAF not become efficient? And this really has to do with what you're using aerobic development for. I believe that aerobic development is the foundation for kind of all fitness. Without it, everything else is going to be either parlor tricks, or it's not going to last very long because you can't efficiently deliver oxygen. In this system that I'm describing, I'm just talking about general physical preparedness. General physical preparedness for me is, this is an arbitrary number, but if you can't run or process aerobically efficiently for an hour, which means I have no fluctuations in my MAF pace or my reaction to the effort for 1 hour of running or whatever you want to measure it by, I really have no business competing in anything. That, I think, is mostly true. I think most people would benefit by first establishing an aerobic foundation of being able to perform aerobically for 1 hour nonstop with no fluctuations in their reaction to the effort, and they would have way better outcomes. Longevity wise, recovery wise, I don't even really care what the sport is. I think that is a fairly good marker. Now, people will be like, oh, cardio's going to kill the gains for strength. And there's lots of people that will argue this. That's totally fine. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. This is literally my opinion from what I've seen is useful in health, longevity, true sport development. I think it has been true for myself. The times in my life when I can run for an hour without kind of any inefficiency showing up, I perform better, I sleep better, I recover better, all of the other performances go up, and it doesn't take that much to actually maintain this ability. I wouldn't promote that the average person should go and do a lactate test. I don't think that A, that's necessary, and B, it's a kind of overkill. Now that doesn't mean it's not good for them. Sure, if you have the resources and you want to dial in exactly, your VO2 max or something like this, have at it. That is not going to add more information is better as long as it's useful information. Where this breaks down though is people get these very expensive tests, or they go all in and they're very excited to get these numbers back. But what are you going to do when you want to really measure how effective your training was? You have to go through that process to run those metrics again. that really becomes unuseful if I'm unwilling to do it. Now, a lactic threshold test is fairly uncomfortable. Like, it's not fun. It's a test. It's gonna hurt. The same thing with the VO2 max test. This is not something that the average person is gonna want to do or have the ability to do frequently. So I turn to the MAF test because A, it's close enough to be accurate. B, you can repeat it frequently enough, weekly. You could do it every day. It's not going to hurt you. That way, I find it very useful to establish kind of where you're at, and you can do it at any time. You could take 6 months off of running, and I can check where I'm at with the math test. And a couple questions on math that I got were like, what happens if my heart rate is very high? What this is referring to is tachycardia. Tachycardia is a high heart rate symptomatic of kind of like some parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous issues that are going on. Erin actually has tachycardia, and so she cannot actually use a MAF score accurately. Now, she can use the same principles after she establishes what she believes is her zone 2. If you are competing and you have tachycardia, I would recommend probably doing a lactic threshold test at least once, just to establish where the baseline is and your conversion of lactate, so I can see where my efficiency is. You could also run a VO2 max test. It's not that big of a deal, but I would probably do something that would be a little bit different. I also do realize that VO2 max tests are becoming much more common. They have like at-home masks and these kind of like interesting app-based technologies. I have not used these. I've heard good things about them so far. If you have access to that, and you're right now getting mad at me because I'm still basically promoting an algorithm from the 80s, and this is driving you crazy because you're a tech nerd, like, take all this with a grain of salt. I haven't used those yet. I would love to like test them, and I probably will some point in the future, not just for VO2 max, but also just for RER, respiratory exchange rate, because all of these things, they inform other things rather than just cardiovascular ability. That's kind of a side note. Just know that if you have above average or below average heart rate and the number that they give you just doesn't make any sense, you need to do some further testing. You're an anomaly, in which case you're like, these generic tests aren't going to work for you. Not a big surprise, but I think people sometimes get lost in the weeds for that. One of the mind-blowing things to me is kind of how undereducated the average person is about aerobic development, because there's fancier, methodology out there. There's exciting things. Developing aerobic fitness is not exciting, but it has exciting outcomes, as in once you do it, you totally understand why to do it. This leads me to kind of the second point that I want to talk about, because it came up as a lot of questions towards the behavioral things that I'm talking about. I see endurance training as a signal for behavior traits that I would look for, as in it helps develop discipline and it helps develop the skill and attribute, and I'll call this a behavior of self-care. I call self-care a behavior because it's a natural reaction, or it is a learned unnatural reaction. Therefore, you see people who self-harm, that is a behavior trait, and that has been developed because of exposure to certain experiences. That's an extreme example to just like, give you some context for how important self-care is. All of these things match up in this continuum of what we call endurance. Endurance changes you. The ability to understand how to prolong effort and get yourself to continue effort when there is a distinct desire not to, is one of the most useful attributes in anything that you might learn. Now, I talked to a friend of mine the other day, and we're talking about, business books and different things that we're learning, businesses, and he was asking me if I knew any other business books that I liked, and I told him I don't like business books. Almost like I don't like fitness books. I don't like when people speak about fitness out of context. I think most fitness books are written for sport, which makes them contextually useless to the other part, even though people will find correlations. Business books are the same. As soon as somebody has like a siloed idea and they just want to gear this towards this one thing, immediately it becomes kind of a perverted version of that subject. And so we landed on this because you asked for business books, and I was telling them that I really like actually biographies and autobiographies to learn business. That I think you get more out of that because you see the people that accomplish the things that you want to do or something similar. They have, you know, these life paths that we can learn from, and they echo throughout history. I'm not just talking about new books. I mean, it's, kind of a trend, but you go back to the Stoics, you go back before that, people have been writing these biographies to really like pass down these lessons to other people. And that is just a considerable amount of wisdom that you can gain. And I find that the second you write on a specific topic and get away from the context of how this topic relates to a life that was lived, you're going to run into issues. On that, we started talking about what the biggest contributing factor for success in all of these biographies that I've read. And then we were going back, like I was talking about James Dyson was like the one that came to mind, who his autobiography is like insane. Now we're talking about a guy who invented a vacuum cleaner. Who fucking cares? But his story is absolutely mind-blowing. Same thing with, you go to the founder of Four Seasons, and there's a bunch of others that just like Estee Lauder is another one, where you would never imagine the trials and tribulations you go through. So we're talking about what I think are the threads that connect these people together. And the thing that I think, and my friend actually agreed with this, I think persistence is probably the most important attribute. I think it's well known that if you were going to pick an attribute from a person to deal with, intelligence might come off as the obvious one, because you would think like if somebody's smart, they'll figure out another way. But intelligence, how we measure it today, is not an accurate predictor of success. In fact, it's like almost not present. But persistence is. Persistence is like the single identifier that I could find, and many other people agree with me, that persistence is the biggest indicator of success. Now, that doesn't mean just business success or monetary or fitness success. It's everything. It's one of these attributes, not taken out of context, is present in almost every successful person. But how do you develop that? Persistence is not just a natural attribute or trait of being a human. It's one that gets passed and learned. It's something that's developed. That to me is crazy, that we don't put these things together and go, oh, endurance is the development of persistence as a physical effort that correlates heavily to a mental, psychological, and emotional ability to persist. This is why the behavior traits are so important. This is also, funny enough, why you see kind of like, maybe I'll include myself in this, because I think that endurance is so phenomenal. Developing it is so good for people. I would consider myself an evangelist for endurance sports. I'm not an endurance athlete by any stretch, but I do believe that developing the ability to endure is one of the most important things that I've ever done in my life. And I could give some context to this, just because most people that don't know, are like, oh, it's just some meathead who's in the gym every day talking about endurance. Like, I don't have some context to put in this. I raced bikes and triathlon for 10 years. I've won races. I competed hundreds of times a year. I also hold a world record for a 24-hour effort. I do know something about the subject of endurance, but I don't think those extreme expressions of it are relatable, or the reason why you should listen to me. I think that you should listen to me if you're interested in developing the idea or the behavior trait of persistence. If you want to be somebody who can see things through to the end, you should develop your aerobic system, because it's quite literally that is what it is. You set out to do something. Somewhere along the line, you're going to not want to do it. It's going to become wildly uncomfortable. It's going to be a psychological problem, not a physical one in most cases. And this is what's really interesting about endurance development and the behaviors that come with it. When you meet somebody who's disciplined and they have the ability to self-care, they are unstoppable. And this is where, I call myself evangelist, because I want to like kind of say this in tongue in cheek, is like, I think what you see today is like the average person finds the magic of endurance and they start preaching it like crazy. That is not uncommon. Zach Thielander on Instagram, no shade thrown towards him. I think he's cool. I like a lot of the stuff that he posts. He started running a couple months ago, and now you kind of see these questions coming up about identity, these deeper things, and he's becoming quickly an evangelist for aerobic development, just based off of his personal experience. And although this can be kind of annoying, it's like, when somebody finds veganism or CrossFit, it's like all they ever talk about. But I kind of want to explain why, because I'll relate this to my experience. My first psychedelic experience was not drug induced. It was on a bike in the mountains in Bulgaria. I was tired. I didn't want to be there. I was so far away from home that I kind of had an outer body experience climbing up this mountain. Nobody could come save me, and nobody knew where I was. And yet it was up to me to get back. And because I had to find a new aspect of my personality, it's almost like I projected myself outside of myself so I could see it. This, by definition, is a psychedelic experience. It's what psychedelia means, mind expanding. Now, it's also one of the reasons why people, are kind of crazy about doing acid their first time, or they do ayahuasca and that's all they want to talk about, because it just blew their mind. They had no concept that this could be an experience that you could have. And endurance is much the same way, except the only people that are going to talk about it are either these new evangelists who really don't understand it yet or understand the implications of what they're saying, or you get these like old timers that are so far on the other side of it that they're almost cynical about endurance. Because here's the balancing act of endurance. Yes, it helps you develop discipline, no doubt. But if you don't recognize that I need to counteract and complement my endurance training with the ability to self-care, you will eventually self-annihilate. And if you don't, the personality trope that I think is most common is cynicism. The amount of endurance athletes that I've met that do not trust other people because they don't trust themselves is absolutely alarming. I can't really have conversations with most ultra endurance types because I see it and I just don't want to be around it. Their disbelief in other humans is because they've put kind of a preternatural belief in themselves being able to do kind of unthinkable acts of endurance. And this leads to a very disproportionate view of what they think of the rest of humanity. And for lack of a better term, it just turns you into an unbeliever of humans. That is because they never learned how to self-care. It is not because endurance is bad. It is not because going too far can wreck you. It's because you don't know what too far is. And you've overwritten your internal negotiation about self-preservation, and you've chosen self-annihilation just in order to finish a race or finish an objective or to do something or to prove yourself. Prove you're not a quitter, man. Prove you're not a bitch. Things that are unbalanced do not have longevity. They cannot hold up to different pressures. Aerobic development for the attributes of endurance, what I'm looking at doing is using discipline and self-care to build trust. That is it. That is the behavior trait I want. Now, I want trust not only in myself, but in other people as well. And this is something that the average endurance junkie or, hot new running evangelist is going to miss, because this takes the longest time. The longest time to endure is a lifetime. It is not the event. I don't care how many days you ran. I don't care how hard you went in a 24-hour period. What I care about is that, can I do it outside of the event itself? So to give you a backstory on this, when Keegan and Roger and myself started planning for this 24-hour assault bike challenge, the first thing we talked about was like a possible pace that we could hold. Now, I have most of the experience with endurance and cycling specifically, and my number that we were going to hold was much lower than the number that they were going to aim for. The reason for that was not because I didn't believe that we could hold that pace. My pace for the 24-hour was based on the fact that I didn't want this to be my last endurance event ever. That being said, I take into consideration when doing something the cost of it after, and this is the true cost of endurance. Yes, you might make it to the finish line, but if you break yourself, you won't do anything after that. I've seen so many people who claim to be endurance athletes. If you can't fucking do it past your prime, you're not doing it correctly. Endurance isn't something to foster for an entire lifetime. That's what I think the most important attribute is of endurance. And I think if you do it properly, by using these methodologies, what you're tapping into is objective measures for the positive attributes that you can get from developing an aerobic system.